Hold on, folks. Henny B is going to peddle something. Ask anyone that knows me, they'll tell you I am not an energy drink kind of guy. I am naturally hyper as it is, and I don't need it. But I know a lot of people who are, and lately they've been drinking Dubby like it's going out of style. Dubby is a flavored powdered supplement that you mix directly into your water. It promises no crash, no jitters, no angst. Head over to Dubby.gg today and enter the coupon code WW1POD for a 10% discount. That's Dubby.gg, and it's proudly made in the USA. I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, The Weight of Feathers. The honks were loud and angry as the gander nipped at her heels. She zigzagged through the large pen, making a conscious effort to avoid running into the other geese, which stood oblivious to the situation unfolding around them. Adrenaline coursed through her, making her heart pound in her chest. But this was exciting. Finally, she reached the safety of the pen's gate, slipping through and latching it behind her. She leaned against the wooden post, catching her breath and laughing at the absurdity of it all. The gander, now thwarted, paced back and forth behind the gate, still honking indignantly. At 15 years old, Colleen Taylor had begun to feel the weight of adulthood. Her father and 3 brothers had all volunteered to serve overseas in the Great War she kept hearing about, leaving her as the oldest child at home with increased responsibilities on the farm. There were potato fields to cultivate and harvest, geese and chickens to tend to, and trips to the market when the time was right. Colleen was not used to these chores as they had traditionally fallen to her brothers. However, when their orders came in, she had no choice but to take over their responsibilities. For 3 frantic weeks, she absorbed as much information as she could from her brothers and father before they left. Today, however, was a light work day. She had fed the chickens, the geese, and the family dog earlier in the day. Now, she planned to go into town, and she was taking feathers. But first, breakfast. She walked across the yard and ambled into the modest farmhouse, and then into the kitchen. "I'm going to go into town, Mama." Her mother, who had been reading a newspaper, looked up. Whatever for? She then gestured at the pancakes and bacon that sat in the middle of the table. "Eat and tell me why. It's not because of what Reverend Jones said on Sunday, is it?" It was obvious she noticed the feathers. Colleen picked up a piece of bacon and stared at it a second. "You heard him. It's our way of helping, and I'm going to do my part today." She shoved the bacon into her mouth voraciously. Her mother put the newspaper down. "Colleen, normally I would never speak ill of the Reverend, but this whole idea of giving white feathers to the men doesn't sit well with me." The Order of the White Feather was formed in Britain in 1914, shortly after the outbreak of war. The campaign aimed to encourage men to enlist in the military by shaming those who were not in uniform with the white feather, symbolizing cowardice. This social propaganda campaign, which had started in London, had now made its way to the small mountain town of Nelson, British Columbia in Canada. Colleen, influenced by the fervent words of Reverend Jones, had come to believe that her living on a farm with geese was a sign that she was meant to join this effort. Colleen looked at her mother quizzically. "Are you forbidding me, Mother?" "My dear, I would never do that. In fact, if you feel that strongly about it, then I encourage it. Take your father and brothers volunteering to fight. I didn't agree with it, but I supported them. Just because I don't agree with something doesn't necessarily mean that it's the wrong thing to do." "Thanks, Mama," Colleen said between bites of a pancake. "I just think that it's only fair. If Papa, Louis, Mason, and Oliver can fight, so can they. Cowards don't deserve peace." That's a little callous, my dear, her mother responded. Not at all, Mama. You and I worry every day. Why should we be the only ones? Her mother stood from the table. I too worry every day. And that feeling, I would never wish on others, my love. Colleen thought a moment. Well, I want everyone to feel what we feel. Her mother sighed, the weight of her daughter's words settling heavily between them. You most certainly are your mother's daughter. She kissed her on the head and walked out of the room, leaving Colleen alone with her thoughts. Colleen finished her breakfast, a sense of righteous determination hardening within her. She grabbed the small bundle of white feathers, put them in a small wicker basket, and walked out the door. 15 minutes later, she arrived at the shore of Kootenai Lake, where she boarded a small ferry that would take her across the lake and into the small town of Nelson. Roughly 5,000 people lived in Nelson, and she was willing to wager that many of the men would need these feathers. As she took her seat in the ferry, she took notice of the boy operating the vessel. How old are you? She asked the boy. He was a tall blond boy with a slim build and green eyes. She knew his name was George, for she had seen him before, but they weren't otherwise acquainted. He glanced down at the feathers in her basket and grinned. I'm 17. She felt the grin was a bit condescending, but hid her malice. And when will you turn 18? In 10 months. The war will be over by then, so you can save your feathers, he replied rather smugly. Or I could give it to you now. That way, if the war's not over by then, you'll have a reminder, she clapped back, irritated. He turned to focus on the duty at hand as he pushed the ferry off the shore and into the lake on their way to the small town. Suit yourself. The journey across the lake was quiet. Neither he nor she said another word to each other. When they reached the other side, she quietly stepped off the ferry and stood on the shore. There, she watched as he walked over to where she had sat and picked up a white feather. He glanced in her direction. As he did, she abruptly turned her back to him and walked away. She was beaming with pride as she walked into the town square. She had already given away one feather. She felt accomplished, like she was doing her part. It was mid-afternoon, and the square was teeming with various residents perusing the shops and the carts that sold vegetables, fruits, and various meats. She took a seat on a bench adjacent to a trading post which her mother frequently visited. From her vantage point, she should be able to see anyone who entered the town square. It did not take long before she spotted a man in street dress enter the square, approach an apple cart, and start inspecting the fruit. She steeled her nerve, stood up, and marched to him. And why aren't you in uniform, sir? She reached into the basket, grabbed a feather, and presented it to him. The man paused his inspection of the apples and turned his head to look at her. Well, if you must know, I have a hernia and they won't take me. She looked him up and down, unsure of how to respond. She decided that she did not believe him. Poppycock, I think you're just a coward. He laughed to himself. Think what you want, miss. I really don't care. With a quick action, Colleen tucked a feather into his breast pocket, then turned quickly away, walking back to the bench where she could again monitor the square. A while later, 4 men walked into the square. She recognized them as school chums of her brother Oliver. Oliver was at war. Why weren't they? She rose on the bench and marched to them. Referring to them by name, she addressed the issue. Hello, Marcus, Elliot, Liam, and Henry. Why are you guys not in uniform? It was Marcus that responded. Why would we be in uniform? We aren't in the army. Colleen rolled her eyes. That's my point. Why aren't you serving, like my brother Oliver? Are you all cowards? Marcus looked down at her with indignation. Maybe we don't want to. She thrust a feather in his face. You're a coward. She continued handing feathers to the other boys. And you're a coward? And you? And you? You're all cowards. With the deed done, she turned on her heels and walked away, leaving the four boys dumbfounded and seemingly contrite. She decided then that she would go home. She had spent 2 hours and gave out 6 feathers. That was a good day's work, she thought. Over the next few weeks, she repeated this cycle. Each and every time, George, the boy running the ferry, ignored her snide remarks, choosing instead to focus on the ferry and its traversing of the lake. This was fine with her. He was a coward anyway. But each time, she left him a feather. All in all, she gave out at least 20 feathers to men and boys around town, not counting the many she gave just to George. When the winter snows came, she stayed on the farm. It was too cold for her or anyone to go into town. The months seemed to pass slowly, aided only by the occasional letter from her father or one of her brothers. Those letters were generally read by her mother after dinner to Colleen and her 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Tiffany. Through those letters, Colleen learned the dismal conditions the soldiers were enduring in places like the Somme River and Ypres. Her father described the endless mud, the constant threat of enemy fire, and the heart-wrenching loss of comrades. Lewis wrote about the sleepless nights in the trenches, plagued by the sounds of shelling and the cries of the wounded. Mason recounted the relentless rain that turned the battlefields into a quagmire, and the gnawing hunger that never seemed to abate. Oliver's letters spoke of the gas attacks, the suffocating fear, and the desperate hope for an end to the carnage. It turned out that none of them were serving together. They had been separated into different regiments, each facing their own battles on different fronts. The letters, read aloud by her mother after dinner, painted a vivid and harrowing picture of the war. Each account was a stark reminder of the sacrifices being made, and with every word, Colleen's resentment towards those who refused to serve grew stronger. She couldn't understand how anyone could stay behind, living in comfort and safety while her family endured such horrors. The letters became a catalyst for her growing determination to see every able-bodied man in uniform doing their part for the war effort. Mother, when the spring comes, I think I'm going to go to the other towns to give out feathers. Her mother had been sitting in her chair doing some needlework. The nearest town is 25 miles away, my dear. I'm afraid I cannot allow that. Colleen had a confused look on her face. Why not? I can walk 25 miles in 6 hours. That's 12 hours there and back. I can spend 4 hours there and walk back and even find a place to stay the night if I have to. Her mother put down her needlework. My dear, just focus on our town. Let others worry about their own. From what I hear, at least 10 of the men in town you gave feathers to volunteered. Colleen let out a heavy sigh. 10 out of the 20 or so I gave out. That means at least 10 are cowards. I can do better if I go to the other towns. The people in Nelson are weak. Her mother couldn't help but roll her eyes. Did you ever think that some of the men have legitimate reasons for not going? Colleen was indignant. Excuses. All of them. Just excuses. We send 4 men just from our family, and the people here make excuses to stay home. They're weak. She was tired of having to explain this to her mother. She wondered why her mother didn't understand. She spent the next few months looking out the window, waiting for the spring and reading the letters from her father and brothers over and over again. Each day steeled her resolve more and more. She was anxious to get back into town and do her part, and she just knew that sometime this spring or summer she would convince her mother to let her go to the other towns as well. The coming of spring, however, did not usher in the ideal traveling conditions that Colleen had hoped for. The roads remained muddy and treacherous from the thawing snow, making any journey to town difficult and time-consuming. It also did not mean that the ice on the lake was gone and that the ferry was operational. The unpredictable weather kept the lake partially frozen, with chunks of ice drifting dangerously, rendering the ferry service unreliable. As she looked out over the still, semi-wintry landscape, Colleen felt her frustration grow. She was eager to resume her mission, but nature seemed determined to delay her plans. Finally, the day came in which travel seemed possible. She awoke early that morning, did her chores, which included gathering some fresh feathers from the geese, and kissed her mother goodbye. She promised she would be home before lunch. The road was still muddy from the melting snow, but all in all she made good time to the lake. However, she had to wait for the ferry. Someone else had crossed already, meaning the ferry was on the other side of the lake. As she waited, she counted the feathers in her wicker basket. There were 22. She glanced up to see the ferry still making its way across the lake. Seemed slower than usual. She pulled out a letter from her brother Oliver and read it, waiting patiently. Oliver's handwriting brought a sense of closeness despite the distance. His words described the camaraderie among the soldiers and the small moments of respite they cherished. Yet the underlying tone of weariness and longing was unmistakable. Colleen's grip on the letter tightened as she read about the latest skirmishes and the constant threat they lived under. The ferry finally approached, and she tucked the letter back into her coat pocket. The operator was an older gentleman, probably George's father. George must be sick, she thought. She took her customary seat and enjoyed the scenery. The green was coming back in abundance all around the lake, but some of the trees were still topped with snow. It was a beautiful sight. 15 minutes later, she was stepping off of the ferry and readying herself to go into town. "Thank you." The older gentleman smiled and looked down at the wicker basket of feathers. "You're welcome, Miss Colleen." She started to make her way to the town. How did he know her name, she thought. She had never met him. All the time she rode the ferry, it was George at the helm. She would ask questions when she went back to cross for home. Something felt off about the town this morning. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. There was a heavy tension in the air, it seemed. People seemed somber, reflective. She made her way to her customary bench and began to watch. From her vantage point, she could see directly down one of the town's little streets. She saw a man with a bag that hung off of his shoulder and down to his hip. He looked like a mail carrier, but it was too early in the day for that, wasn't it? She looked on as the man stopped at a house. He seemed to take a deep breath as he walked up to the door. He knocked, and a woman answered. He handed her something. It looked like a letter, accompanied by something black. The woman didn't even open the letter. She fell to her knees and started to wail. It was then that she noticed a few of the other townspeople were being consoled by others. They all had letters. They all had the black item. Some even wore it. It was an armband. A black armband. The delivery man made his way across the square, and she stood to intercept him. She stepped in his path as he drew closer. "Excuse me, what's going on? What do you have there?" He stopped and gazed at her with a somber look. He looked like an animal that was hungry, she thought to herself. "It's the first day we've been able to travel in months. These notices just piled up over the winter." A curious look came across her face. "What kind of notices?" "We're at war, kid. These are death notices. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a few more to deliver here, and then I have 3 other towns to hit before the sun goes down." "So, everyone with a black armband?" "I'm afraid so, kid." He watched her look down at her basket of feathers. "It's not your fault, kid." And he briskly walked on. She stood for a moment watching the various scenes that were on full display in the little town. There was so much grief. She took her place on the bench and lost herself in thought. She thought about the men she gave feathers to. Were any of these notices for them? Of course some were. It was silly to think they weren't. She sat for an hour. One by one, the grieving people retreated into their homes or shops. The streets and the square were empty. She felt empty too. She started for home. She reached the ferry at the lake and again had to wait for it to make its trek from the other side before she could board. She took her customary seat. "Excuse me, how did you know my name?" she asked the older gentleman. He didn't take his eyes off of the water. "George told me." Curiosity reared its head again. George told you, but why? It's a funny thing thinking about it now. He kept coming home with feathers, and even though the two of you never truly met, he knew your name, and you obviously knew his. His voice broke a bit as he spoke. Maybe if the situation had been different, you could have been friends. She smiled a large, radiant smile. We can still be friends. He's a nice boy. I like him. He turned to look at her. There was a tear in his eye. I'm afraid that's not possible now. It was then that she saw the notice, laying on the floor of the ferry, and the black band lying next to it. This is my fault, she said quietly to herself. I kept giving him feathers. I told him he was a coward. He let go of the rudder and turned to look at her. The ferry started to drift. I know. And each time you did, you chipped away bit by bit at his confidence, so much so that he decided to fake his age and volunteer. He left in the early winter. His mother and I didn't even know where he went until we got his first letter from France. He turned and retook control of the rudder. So yes, it is your fault. She was still in a daze when the ferry reached the other side of the lake. George's father said nothing more to her during the short journey. When she stepped off the ferry, she looked back at him with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry. His look was like ice. You're only sorry because he died. And he shoved off. Colleen started towards her home. It was a small muddy path that led from the lake to the farm. Along the way, she cried. She could not wrangle her thoughts together. She just wanted to do her duty. She did not know that it would cause this much pain and resentment. She froze just outside of the fence line of the farm as she saw the delivery man standing on her porch. She watched helplessly as her mother dropped to her knees, holding 2 notices and 2 black armbands. This has been World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the show wherever you find this podcast, and don't forget to throw us a comment and a rating. We are on Facebook. Just search and like the official World War I Stories page. You can also join me on Blue Sky, where I go by the handle WW1Stories_HennyB. World War I Stories is now featured on Rabbit in Red Radio, with new episodes streaming Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. They also have all episodes available on demand. Visit Rabbit in Red Radio for this and many other independent podcasts. And last but not least, would you like your name read on the show? Become a producer by contributing to our Patreon at patreon.com/World War I Stories. I'm very grateful to everyone who downloads and listens to this show. I'm Henny B, and see you next time on World War I Stories.